we're behind the rest of the world on being able to deploy industrialized construction at scale for home building.
Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Housing Insiders, the podcast for founders, builders, lenders, and regulators, and anyone who believes that everyone should be well housed. I'm Jonathan Lawless.
And I'm Jeremy Potter. On Housing Insiders, we're hosting the conversations you won't hear anywhere else about how to make housing more innovative and attainable.
We're very fortunate to have our partner, Built Rewards, again, sponsor these smart conversations for you. As always, if you have an idea for a guest or a show or have interest in sponsoring an episode, you know that you can always email us at podcast@thehousinginsiders.com.
And if you like the show, you can help us by giving a review, spreading the word, and sharing our podcast so we can make more of these for you.
So today is going to be a great episode. I can guarantee you that because we have an amazing guest, Sean Roberts, the CEO of Villa Homes. Villa Homes manufacture, well, he sort of helps facilitate sort of industrialized construction, specifically for accessory dwelling units right now. But, obviously there's a lot of use cases for that. I know he's focused on things that are happening in California as people are rebuilding after the wildfires. But look, we're going to have a great conversation about all sorts of things related to ADUs and industrialized construction.
Yeah, Sean, thank you for joining us.
Well, thanks for having me. I'm excited for the conversation.
Right on. One of the things that you mentioned and John just mentioned is that, ADUs are quote unquote where the action is right now, what everyone's talking about, and this huge opportunity. And then also we want to expand into understanding industrialized construction and offsite construction. So I'm curious if you could just start us out, give us the lay of the land for you and for your business model, starting with ADUs, but also, where do we go from there?
Sure. Well, so at Villa, we, at our core, are an offsite home building platform, which means a few different things. We essentially partner with a number of different third-party manufacturers of offsite structures to create really efficient, fast to build, and highly certain construction outcomes in hard to build infill locations. The business was started about almost 6 years ago now, focused on ADUs in California, building one at a time in individual homeowners' backyards. And we've now done several hundred of those across more than 100 different jurisdictions throughout California, as far north as wine country and as far south as San Diego, and pretty much everything in between. And that for us was really, one, a pretty interesting part of the housing problem set to focus on, to be able to do ADU construction for homeowners that needed additional space or some rental income or lots of different reasons to build an ADU. But what that really did for us was position the business into a set of capabilities that go well beyond just building ADUs. So we work all the way through the life cycle of a project in a way that's very similar to a design build firm, where we'll start working with a client at the initial concept. We'll run through feasibility of a project, due diligence on the site. We'll do site design, home design, all the cost estimating. We'll handle all the pre-construction work around getting permits. We'll then orchestrate all the construction activities. We're the general contractor during the build. We handle all the project management, factory coordination, logistics, site management. And we basically provide a turnkey solution for building an offsite built home, which makes it really easy for, as we started initially with individual homeowners building ADUs, but that's since scaled into a few different verticals over the last couple of years, including we're now building ADUs in California alongside multifamily properties, which is a somewhat new area, but it makes a lot of sense when you think about the number of low-rise garden-style apartment properties that exist really all throughout the country, but particularly in California, that have excess land, trash enclosures, extra parking, underutilized amenities that can be turned into housing. And so we focused on that a lot with a variety of institutional owners, including public REITs, private equity funds, independent private owner operators, and we're adding density to multifamily properties with ADUs. It's a very similar process to what we do for a consumer's backyard, but we're doing it beside an apartment building. And we've also started to do, as you mentioned earlier, fire rebuilds in Southern California using offsite construction. We've expanded the business into Colorado, where we're doing some pretty interesting things with modular construction there as well. And really, the way that we think about our business is we're an on ramp for capital that has land and a need for housing to access industrialized construction at scale with a set of capabilities that can bring a project really from design to doorbell all the way through. And that's what we do.
It's so cool. Something, Sean, I think we've definitely talked about in the past, and certainly in the sort of context where we've run into each other. But thinking about the house as a product, as opposed to sort of what it is today, a service, like it's just so hard for any individual homeowner to build any, to do anything related to housing. Whereas like, I sort of dream of a future where it's like an iPhone, where it's, reliable, it's pre-constructed. But the one aspect I wanted to focus on, in fact, I could use your help on this, because I have a meeting actually tomorrow with Fannie Mae, is on the financing side. So I'd love to hear your take on how people are financing ADUs, how well it's, is it working? Where is it not working? And then I think really importantly, if a Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac were to create a product, a second lien product that sort of standardize it, like, can you sort of help me articulate what the benefits of that would be?
Sure. Well, just to scope this in. So, when we talk about financing, this is more through a consumer lens of an individual homeowner adding one ADU to their backyard. So, let's take the institutional stuff and the multifamily things and put
Yep.
that off to the side for now. So for an individual homeowner who's looking to build an ADU, a lot of those folks do need some form of financing. And what we saw before rates started going up a few years ago, a lot of folks would do a cash out refi on their primary mortgage. But with mortgage rates where they are today, that's far, far, far less common. And many folks are using HELOCs, renovation loans, different products that are often more provided by portfolio lenders that are holding paper on their balance sheet. And more often than not, we're seeing the credit unions in California be some of the most competitive lenders with the best structures for consumers.
Mm.
And we have a few different lending partners that we work with that have pretty good products for that. That being said, the nature of an ADU loan is a little bit idiosyncratic, especially if you're doing it with offsite construction, because that home is inherently, from the consumer's perspective, they don't want to touch their primary mortgage. So it's inherently a second lien position, if you're trying to leave the primary mortgage in place. And you're building a new structure with offsite construction, which can have a very different set of draw schedules and funding mechanics than traditional construction. And because those loans are second lien and the draw structure is a little different, there isn't a particularly robust secondary market for that paper today. And as a result, that means that, yeah, the most competitive lenders are those that are holding it on their balance sheet and doing portfolio lending. And there's some of that. I wish there was a lot more. But it's really hard for more lenders to get into the space because they can't move the paper out the back door into the secondary market. And that paper inherently probably ought to trade at or wide of where non-QM loans are. And so it becomes pretty expensive money for the borrower at the end of the day. And that has the effect of making the cost of financing a new ADU build pretty expensive
Mm-hmm.
sometimes for the end consumer. Again, everyone has a different credit situation and there's a wide spectrum of different products that are out there. But generally, I'd say the ADU construction financing market is far less efficient than it can and should be compared to the primary home financing market. And I would love to see Fannie and Freddie get much more active with products that can support ADU construction nationally.
And one thing that we know is that the originating community, right, mortgage lenders and mortgage brokers want more things to sell. So it's really that secondary market giving the liquidity. But my gut is telling me this second lien, as compared to other second liens, is lower risk because you're enhancing the value of the property and there's the potential for future income if you go that direction. Would I be wrong in that assumption? Why does it feel like a lower risk second lien, but it trades as a higher risk? Simply liquidity? Shouldn't this be viewed by many as a lower risk option?
I think that's spot on. And intuitively, that hypothesis makes a lot of sense. I think the reality is ADUs are still relatively new, and having a data set with long duration credit performance that can allow the capital markets to underwrite that accurately just doesn't exist yet, or it exists in a very nascent, spotty way. So that'll come, and I think that'll be proven out over time, because you're right. These second lien ADU loans should perform pretty darn well, and that's what we've seen in what we've been building over the last several years. So I think that hypothesis is right, but in order for the capital markets to be able to provide that kind of liquidity, they need data to underwrite to, and that right now is pretty thin.
Yeah. I mean, even with that, I mean, one of the core challenges that the GSEs will face if they do create a product is it's unclear what kind of capital they need to allocate to the product. And the capital is going to be based on what risk they view of the product. And so I think today, if they weren't going to change anything, they would view the product just like a standard cash out. And cash outs, when they're used for things like paying off student loans or things that financially benefit you, actually perform way better than cash outs that are used to buy a boat, or maybe even the cases of where it's super risky and it's debt consolidation, right? And so, the thing that we've got to figure out how to do, at least with the GSEs, is make the argument that the intuition should tell you that cash outs used for income generating things or beneficial things are the sort of the data point that you should be looking at, given that we don't have a data point today. Part of the thing that becomes necessary, if that's the argument that the GSEs will accept, is that you have to believe that the ADUs could serve an income generating purpose. They don't have to initially, but if the point is being made that, like, hey, if in a bad scenario, this person has the ability to turn around and turn this into a rental property, even if they're using it for family or so, whatever, an office. So I'm kind of curious to get what you've seen in the market today. What are sort of the common uses for ADUs? Is it a full house that has a kitchen and a bathroom, so on and so forth? Or are you seeing, more popularity of backyard gyms or backyard offices or whatnot?
Well, the first thing is, by definition, an ADU does have to have a kitchen and sanitary services and bedroom space. And so they always are a self-contained, full service housing unit.
Yep.
That doesn't mean they're always used that way. I'd say what we've seen on the consumer channel is probably a little more than half of the folks that we build for use them for long-term rental income generating purposes. And the
Mm-hmm.
other half are using it for a variety of personal uses that can span everything from a space for family to stay, a home office, a home school environment, a gym. There's a lot of different use cases, and it really comes down to who the end homeowner is and what they need the space for and what their living situation is like. So it varies dramatically, and there's not like a one size fits all kind of use case, but all of these units at the end of the day, to your point, can be rented, and rented pretty well, because typically ADUs are being built in desirable existing neighborhoods where folks want to be. They're in good school districts, they're close to where people want to live and work and go to school, and they can rent really, really, really well. And we've seen that time and time again in both what we've built for homeowners and in the multifamily space. And sometimes the ADUs can actually rent at a pretty interesting premium to other rental housing stock, because in the case of what we focus on at Villa, which are detached standalone structure ADUs that are typically a bit larger, those units are really attractive. You're basically getting something that's like a small entry level single family home, which can be a lot more compelling than being an older apartment stock with someone living on top of you and beside you. And it's a great product, and it can work really well for income generation.
That's exciting because of what it could mean in different use cases across the country. We talk about ADUs in the West and in California especially, but the way you just described it, for urban infill anywhere, it has this really interesting application. And so I kind of want to frame my question this way, Sean. Can you tell us the trends you're seeing? And to me, it feels like two related trends I wanted to get your opinion on. One is urban infill is hard regardless. Whether it's LA or Detroit, urban infill is just difficult. Is that the full story, or is there also obstacles and barriers to prefab, offsite, or manufactured styles that add to the complexity? And I want to understand how much of it is just urban infill, regardless, and how much of it is, are there additional challenges, or should this be easier?
Yeah, let's say in general, urban infill, whether you're doing a home in someone's backyard or building on a vacant lot or filling in a multifamily property, all of which we do, it can be challenging whether you're building on site or building with some kind of offsite industrialized approach because you have pretty idiosyncratic site conditions and logistical considerations because you're not building in a big open area. So you need to be very focused on logistics, site safety, really understanding the utilities that are in place. And sometimes, one of the things that we've learned, having done this hundreds of times now, is not everything is discoverable before you put a shovel in the ground. And there may be a gas line that's running through where you want to put a structure that wasn't on the survey. And now you got to deal with that. And a lot of the idiosyncrasies around power, water, sewer, gas, connecting into all of that stuff can be pretty well understood if you're working with an experienced builder who understands infill and can figure that out on the front end. But if you're not thoughtful about those things, they can really drive a lot of pretty expensive and time consuming delays downstream in infill construction. And that's just part of what it is. So experience and data really matter to get it right. And then as it relates to doing it with offsite construction, there are some clear benefits to that. Probably the most acute benefit for infill construction with offsite is speed. So it's less disruptive to the local community. And if you're building in an area where you're living in your primary home or you have an occupied multifamily building and there's people coming and going and you've got an existing community around where you're building, the ability to come in and get in and out of that job site quickly really matters to minimize disruption and keep everything rolling along quickly. And that also has a bunch of financial benefits. You have fewer inspections on site, you have more cost certainty, you have more timeline certainty. The fact that you don't have as many on-site inspections is nice. So there's a lot of benefits of building off-site, but it doesn't work everywhere. So for example, the way that we build is with volumetric approaches, meaning that the home structures are built as a three-dimensional box in a factory and they're brought into the end site on a truck. And so there are locations, the vast majority of locations that can work with, but there are some where the truck can't physically get down the road or make a corner to get the unit into where you need it to be. And you may be dealing with issues of overhead power lines or areas where you need to use a crane and you can't stage the crane. And so it doesn't work absolutely everywhere, but it does work in the vast majority of cases. But again, you kind of need to know what you're looking at on the front end of the feasibility of the project to assess whether offsite is going to work in that particular infill location. And it's super idiosyncratic.
Yeah, let's drill more into offsite and industrialized construction because it's it's a topic that I think a lot about, and we've had a number of guests on the show that have various aspects of this. Either they run factories or whatnot. Give me your sense. So, like the one of the most influential papers in my mind on this topic that I've read is Lynn Fisher wrote a paper about sort of how industrialized construction is the solution that never comes. It's we always want to do it. There's been numerous times in the history of the country where we try to do it and it ultimately never works. Now it seems to, again, have this momentum. But I'd love to hear from you. Just give me your survey of industrialized construction. And honestly, like, I'd love to hear your views in terms of like, what are some of the major obstacles for it to actually get to the scale that we know it needs to be at?
One thing is it is working and delivering a lot of units a year. Like if you include HUD code manufactured product, over 100,000 structures a year are being built with volumetric offsite construction. So a lot of it is happening, but a lot more of it should be happening. Our perspective on the broader offsite construction world and our thesis for the next really decade plus in construction is what has been true for the last 50 years of the HUD code being in place and offsite construction having a lot more potential than actual volume behind it is going forward. There's a few trends that really come into making the dynamics of building offsite very different than they have been for the last few decades. Probably the first and foremost is labor availability. And as skilled construction labor continues to age out and move out of the workforce, that will continue to put cost pressures and timeline pressures around infill or around all residential site built construction, but it'll be particularly acute for smaller projects in infill areas. And that's where we see one of the most compelling fits for offsite construction is in really high cost labor constrained areas where it's just really hard to build on site. That's where offsite's going to continue to gain more and more share, which is what we've seen in our business over the last few years. But that problem will continue to likely get worse on the labor side. And then when you combine that with interest rates being higher than they have been, I mean, they're kind of like around sort of long-term historical norms. Like interest rates are not crazy high right now, but they're higher than they have been for the last, 10 or 15 years following the financial crisis. And the reality is in a world where, time is money, quite literally with interest expense, being able to go fast on site is important. And we're seeing a pretty broad trend in home building more broadly, including all the way up to the large publicly traded production home builders who are moving to increasingly land light models where speed matters to drive return on capital. And in a world where that's true, which it is, that advantages offsite construction because you need to be able to turn land that you're buying just in time into a completed home product as fast as humanly possible to turn your capital over. And in that world, it's really hard to stick build at scale, and especially in smaller scale things. So it's a different set of sort of macroeconomic realities around offsite construction going forward. And then when you couple that to go to the second part of your question about where are we going forward, we're seeing a lot of like policy and building code reform happening across the country. And that spans everything from land use reform to more rigorous modular code standards that are more accepting of offsite construction. We're seeing capital market support, which is still pretty far behind where it should be broadly. But the capital markets, especially the lending side of the equation, is getting smarter about offsite construction and providing increasing levels of funding support for projects, which is really, really important. And when you think about it objectively from a creditor's or from the lender's perspective, like offsite construction is less risky, right? Like you've got a whole lot more price certainty, timeline certainty, a higher performance building. Like that's a good thing from a lender's perspective. So I think we'll see more and more lenders getting excited about it, and this whole ecosystem across, the trades, the capital efficiency, the cost efficiency, the speed, the capital, like all this stuff comes together to making the future of offsite construction something where it's going to move a little bit faster, perhaps a lot faster than it has over the last couple decades, because it kind of has to.
Yeah, your comments were a very succinct summary of where we are. And you mentioned a few things that popped imagery into my head. So you have these different lanes that we all need to move forward, and they're moving forward incrementally. You mentioned policy, liquidity, the product, and the demand. And I'm imagining all those bars kind of inching forward, but on these like different schedules. And the other imagery that you sparked in my mind was I'm based in Detroit. And so, I saw the big three car companies here move to EV and then move from EV to autonomous, largely because of pressure from new competitors entering the market, right? So, of course, you could point to Tesla and say, like, the big three were going to move to EV. The big three were going to move to EV and probably autonomous anyway, but an outside pressure forced them to go faster. And I'm curious from your perspective, it makes me think that the establishment builders are moving there anyway. And it kind of takes this competition to move faster. As you look across demand from the consumer, the changes that we need on the policy level and competition, what's the next incremental step we could expect or should expect? How are you thinking about what's the next milestone for all of these moving pieces?
I think it's just building more really attractive homes that people actually want to live in. And, it takes time to move the needle in this industry, but your analog about the big three in auto manufacturing can be translated pretty directly into the offsite industry. There's a big three in offsite construction in America as well. Like if you look at the manufactured home space, there are three really big players that command about a little over 85% market share. And those are Clayton, which is owned by Berkshire Hathaway, Champion Home Builders, which is publicly traded, and Cavco. And those three companies each have a factory footprint of 30 to 40 plants across the country. They're large players that are building tens of thousands of homes a year off-site. So they have a pretty massive marginal cost advantage. And we've started to see them really innovate on the product side around what they can do, both through the lens of manufactured homes getting just really, really good in terms of the product quality and being able to go into new applications like cross mod with really good consumer financing. And those companies are increasingly moving into modular typologies as well. And their scale and cost advantage is over time, I believe, going to be something that increasingly takes more and more of the home building pie and moves into the site built world in certain parts of the country, and it'll happen incrementally over time. But it kind of has to happen if we're going to keep up with housing demand in this country. And those companies they're all of our suppliers. We build with them today. They're great. They build a great product that people want, and they've got a pretty big structural kind of cost in product quality and product appeal advantage, and it's super consistent when it comes out of a factory. So I think we'll see that big three kind of moving in a bit of a different direction over the next decade, and we're already starting to see a lot of that coming out of them. And hopefully what that means is this isn't a game of the overall pie stays the same size and offsite just takes more and more of a larger and larger slice, but rather the whole pie grows and we can actually build more homes in America because we can kind of change what the overall cost curve looks like. And that's how we can create something that actually moves the needle a bit on affordability and availability of housing by just building more overall.
I've had a view that I don't know if I hold anymore, but I want to get your opinion on it, which is, when I was thinking about how Tesla entered the market, they didn't start with the affordable EV. They started with the most unaffordable EV, sort of a $250,000 roadster that just really energized the imagination of people for what EV vehicles could really be. I've thought about translating that into like industrialized construction, which is like, if industrialized construction could build like a really, really cool, awesome home. And you see a lot of these on the cover of Dwell magazine, or, like companies like Vive are producing these uber modern, really cool looking things. But the truth is, like, the companies you mentioned are building like what we just saw in the mall a couple weeks ago here in DC, which are like pretty nice, one floor, single wide or double wide homes. And I do think there is a sort of, like, I've always marveled, like, it's so cool that something like this could come out of a factory, but then I don't think I would ever want to live in one of them. It's not like the Tesla Roadster that's really kind of driving my imagination. So one of the things you just said, which is what sparked this question in my mind, is like, just go build some really beautiful homes. But is there a possibility that industrialized construction can really hit the higher end of the market so it doesn't feel like an affordable play? And again, I know that a lot of the units don't look like affordable, like they were meant to be affordable, but they still are one floor and small. So anyway, just curious to get your thoughts on that.
Well, yeah, so there's a whole bunch of things in there. So, one, building a home, like everyone loves to draw the comparison between like auto manufacturing or consumer electronics and apply it to home building. And like, that's just wrong in my mind. Like, it's not a product like a car because it's a home. It needs to comport with the local context of where it's going. And there's a lot of complexity that gets added around not just the box coming out of a factory, but all the other elements of where it goes and how it's going to perform and who's going to live in it. And there's just a lot more. There's a lot more that goes into it, frankly. And so, well, a lot of the principles of mass manufacturing, being able to reduce cost and go faster and add more certainty, that's all absolutely true. But the way that we look at it is, at the end of the day, it's a home. And the part of the market that we're focused on is not so much the high end. We see ourselves as like, we want to be like the Toyota Camry of housing, which is where the fat part of the demand curve is and where most consumers across America can afford something.
Hmm.
And what you can do is create a really appealing, attractive offsite built product and be able to do that, faster, more cost efficiently, and provide someone with a home that they can ultimately afford to live in. That to me is a bigger opportunity and a bigger impact to the market than trying to focus on really high end modular stuff. And the part of the problem there is there are companies that have tried that. You mentioned a few, and there's several others. That ends up being really, really hard to scale through an industrialized approach because, one, the end consumer that wants that really high end luxury home, oftentimes they want something really, really, really custom. if they're going to go to that luxury price point. And what does that mean? Well, they want to hire their own architect and design build firm and do something that's going to be much better suited for site built construction, which totally makes sense, right? Like they should get what they want if they're spending a few $1,000,000 on, a really bespoke high end home. There's a market for that. And I hope it continues to grow. And I hope more and more of that can go down the modular route over time. But that's just not where we're focused or where we see the biggest opportunity in the market, which is much more of like the middle of the fairway kind of, homes that the average person wants to actually live in. And so it's kind of like, again, housing is a big spectrum, but we're less focused on that high end. And I'm not sure that the economies of scale of mass manufacturing are well suited to building a more bespoke product at that high end, because you end up having to run your factory as more of a job shop rather than a production line. And then that starts to defeat some of the advantages of cost and speed as well. So it's like, kind of take the Toyota approach of, go for the middle of the market. And that's what we focus on and where we see the biggest opportunity.
Yeah, it makes a ton of sense. Let's take a quick break to hear from our sponsor, and Jeremy will bring us back in. Built Rewards is a payment platform for housing that rewards members in their home and neighborhood. Built is the payment platform for over 5 million units because Built provides incredible value to residents and to property owners and managers that use it. Properties using Built have seen reduced turnover, increased usage of electronic payments, and fewer missed payments. And with our latest resident loyalty program, Built is changing the way that property managers can reward good behavior. Managers can assign rewards and benefits to tenants for a variety of activities like early lease renewal. If you're interested in learning more, go to alliance.builtrewards.com.
Welcome back to Housing Insiders. We're talking to Sean Roberts, the CEO of Villa Homes. And where we left it, Sean, you mentioned we probably shouldn't look at auto or consumer tech as the comp for this product. We probably shouldn't look to luxury. So, one of the places we might be able to look, and I'd like your take on this, is can we look overseas and learn from other markets, or is our market unique? So, our producer Caroline pulled some numbers. A quarter of homes in France use prefab or industrialized aspects, about half in Belgium. We know robots and factories are building multifamily buildings in Germany and Poland. Can we look abroad? Is there something you're looking at outside to bring to our market, or is that also a place we shouldn't look?
Oh, absolutely. A lot of the countries you mentioned, and there are many others too, like you could add Japan to the list, are building a much higher percentage of their housing stock with offsite industrialized approaches. And that's for a bunch of different reasons around building codes, labor market realities, material supply chains. There's a whole bunch of things that are different in those countries than in the US. But the reality is the US is still at a very small, low single digit percentage of offsite construction being utilized across the entire home building value chain. And it's a little murky here too, because even some of the site built product that gets built has elements of offsite where big production builders are prefabbing trusses and walls and things offsite. So it's like, it's probably already higher than people think here when you start to look at it through that lens. But nonetheless, we're behind the rest of the world on being able to deploy industrialized construction at scale for home building. And there's a whole lot of reasons for that. But I think we're starting to see, given some of the macro trends that I mentioned and changes in code and changes in financing, like things are moving in this direction. And there are a lot of lessons we can draw from other countries. Like our team was over in Sweden earlier this year looking at factories there to understand how they do what they do. And there's a lot of lessons that we can learn from how folks are doing this offsite. Like if you take Sweden, for example, one of the things that our team heard from the factories there is they came over to the US in the 70s and kind of saw what we were doing with offsite. And they just kind of kept doing it for 50 years and just got better and better and better at it. And now it's a huge percentage of what they build there. And the US just kind of like flatlined. And so for a whole bunch of different reasons, but we're behind and we should be catching up on this because that's ultimately at the end of the day good for the person living in the home.
Yeah, and we've definitely talked a lot about building codes on the show, and when we talked to Ivan at Modex, and you mentioned building codes as being a really big difference between what we have here, unfortunately, versus the rest of the world. But I want to ask maybe a little different question, just in terms of what you've seen internationally, because Volumetric industrialized construction, that tends to be where people's minds go to when we talk about industrialized construction. But as you just pointed out, like sometimes it's just like if you could pre-cut wood or pre-do, a truss or something like that. And so there's all sorts of varieties of this. And the one that I've always thought most interesting is panelized, just because it seems to have a real advantage in terms of its being able to be transported and whatnot. So anyway, given all these different types of industrialized construction, and there's probably no one best solution, but when you look overseas and when you think of where we have opportunity here, is it volumetric, or do you see panelized or some of these other approaches as being the ones most likely to be successful?
I mean, hopefully it's all of the above, because
Right.
we need kind of every tool in the toolbox to build more housing. What I'd say as it relates to volumetric versus panelized in particular is panelized has not come quite as far along as it can and should. And what I mean by that is when we build with our factory partners homes volumetrically offsite, there may be 20 stations on the production line that go all the way from the initial floor cassette all the way to a finished home with like literally the blinds on the windows at the end of it. And so you're able to control your entire material supply chain, quality, labor, like everything is right there in the factory, which allows you to do it really quickly and efficiently through all the required trades. With panelized, you might be replacing the first two, three, or four stations around framing. But with panelized, the way that a lot of panel shops build, and this isn't true of all, but the vast majority of them don't necessarily do like all the MEP connections. And so you end up
Mhm.
still having to do a lot of the labor on site. So you skip a few steps. That's great. That saves some cost and it saves some time. But panelized doesn't give you the full spectrum of efficiencies that you can get by doing as much as humanly possible in a factory setting. And that's really where a lot of the cost and complexity it can be kind of hidden in the panelized approach, is getting all those connection points and all the utilities and everything kind of tied together on site. And that, by the way, is where some of the highest cost and most skilled field labor is, which can be often the most scarce part of this. And a lot
Mm.
of those trades don't necessarily know how to put that panelized product together. So it's an even narrower base of trades to be able to do that work. So I'm optimistic that improvements can be made in how panelized is done in America, because it does make a lot of sense. But there's still a lot of evolution in terms of the physical product, the methods of how it's built, and really trying to converge panelized with a volumetric approach, which is going to require innovations on how both code applies to it and how things are done between the factory and the field, in my mind. Like I would love to be able to build with panelized. We've just found that like the math doesn't work as well on that as volumetric.
I share, your view on both things, right? I'm optimistic as well on these different styles, and I also often find myself saying we need a lot of different types because of how unique, like you said earlier, each site needs its own solution in a lot of cases. And as we look at what fits what, you kind of need this broad toolkit or this broad product suite. But in doing that, it sounds like in your answer you've identified some gaps, or we're going to dig into these gaps right now. And let me see if I have this right, which is we actually really need to iterate and try a lot of these different models to get everyone, the market and policymakers, comfortable with these different types, because we want a lot of different types and we want the private market to compete for the best type for that area, that urban infill, that market, that subdivision, what have you. But it becomes really difficult, it seems, to do R&D or innovation in this space because you can't really do a trial house. It's too expensive in many cases, except for the big three. And so I'm curious, how do we fill in these gaps? How are you thinking about bridging the gap to where we can have people trying different things, but doing it in a way that isn't totally blowing the budget when we're talking about really complex real world products that people have to live in? And it seems like there's a big gap between trying things and then getting them in market or getting them in production. I'm curious your thoughts on that gap.
Yeah. Well, I'd say like home building might be one of the hardest categories in America to innovate in, because you have so many constraints around building codes, financing, land use, blah, 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 blah. There's so many things that create just layers of constraints that you have to operate within. And that ties your hands on doing some things some ways because of just the realities of how the industry is regulated through a lot of different layers of constraints. And your point about you're building a home. This isn't like building software where you can sort of like run a sprint, ship it out, make some changes, and push through an update later. Like, you've built a home, and someone's going to live in that home probably for a few decades. So the bar for what you go out and physically do in the real world is way, way, way higher. And so, we are doing this. We are pushing the envelope on different typologies that can be built offsite in different applications, but we do it in a way that is very prudent and careful and pretty well researched and understood on the front end around what it's going to cost, what it's going to evolve, what's going to be involved in the project, and verifying that there's, end demand for it at the end of the day. We take a bit of a different approach than some other companies where instead of designing a really, really beautiful product that we try and push out into the world and assume that people will want to buy it, we really start with end user research and understanding what do people want and where are the applications for offsite construction, and then we work backwards from that demand to create or adapt products to suit that demand. So we have a little bit more certainty of if we build it, someone's going to want it, and that matters a lot. And like at the end of the day, it's kind of smaller to mid-sized projects where you're not exposing too much capital to too much risk all at once, and doing it kind of incrementally over time in projects that can work. And some of it is, taking a mindset of being not overly dogmatic about one specific building typology or factory or method. It's being willing to try things that are maybe a bit more of a hybrid. Like, we're doing some projects now where we'll do as much as we can in the factory, but we may be coming on site and then stick building certain elements of garages, or bringing in a more complicated roof system that's assembled on site, or applying certain interior exterior finishes on site because the factory isn't as well suited to do those. So we do kind of a hybrid approach, which we're experimenting with in different typologies to be able to make the project as efficient as possible by doing as much in the factory as we can, but then stopping the factory scope for certain things that we can do better with more conviction on kind of cost and speed and quality by doing certain things in the field as the GC.
Yeah, and it sounds like that glue from start to finish is really what was missing in a lot of projects. And so as I hear you describe it, I hear you describing like the consistent oversight and transparency, and for lack of a better word, glue that kind of brings it from demand all the way through. And that's been one of the challenges of the industry as well.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, this is kind of one of the themes behind our business, is creating kind of like a clear on-ramp for an investor developer, group that has land and capital and a need to build homes. And a lot of those groups today are very used to building things on site. They have their entire value chain figured out. They know how to do it. They know what it's going to cost. They're good at it. They've done it before. They have lenders that can support that. That's great. But for that group to even explore the feasibility of switching to an offsite approach is hard, because they then need to navigate, which of the more than 200 factories across the country should we be looking at, and why? What are their capabilities? There's not a great way to navigate that. Which design and engineering firms can plug into that, and not just design a really beautiful, desirable home product, but think through the design for manufacturing and assembly implications of doing that in a factory setting. Which GCs can actually do the project, and then the whole other base of vendors, subs, trades, shippers, insurance, lenders, all that stuff is different. And so what we've built is a way for that investor developer group with land and capital to come to Villa and be able to figure out how to approach home building with industrialized construction by leveraging a lot of the experience and data that we have to assess the feasibility of a project, figure out the right factory, and then we do all the back end fulfillment as the GC. And that creates exactly what you're describing, the glue that pulls all this together and provides a really compelling on-ramp for these investor developers, of which we are one ourselves, by the way, to actually access industrialized construction with a set of execution capabilities that the factories in and of themselves don't have that full stack. And we think that that's a pretty important part of the value chain here to make industrialized construction actually get bigger and more impactful in America.
Yeah, with considerably less credibility than what you have in this space. I'm gonna try to disagree with you on one point, which you sort of made the distinction between industrialized construction and the automotive industry. And how I've often sort of thought about this is that the goal of doing something in a factory is that you can really scale up the volume quickly. And the margins on building a home are thin. And so, like, if you're going to invest in a business and you're going to build a $50 million factory to sort of build a home, and you can only build, I don't know, 10 homes a month out of that factory, you're just never going to hit the scale to make that feel like a great investment. Versus if you did something that was fully automated that could just like crank out homes, like the same home constantly over and over, but very quickly, then that becomes just a much more attractive business as an investment. Now, where you kind of sit in the thing is like you have a scalable business model, right? Because you've got this sort of connectivity approach. And the more that comes through, you don't have to build a new connectivity approach. You don't have to invest a lot more, maybe in staff, but like anyway, the profitability scales very well for your business. And I just get the sense for a lot of these factories that, I mean, a lot of them are, at 70, 80, 90% capacity, and they're just not killing it from a profitability perspective. And honestly, they're just not, I mean, they're building things inside a house, inside a factory, but like they're building it just like Lennar would build homes on site. It's not like not a different product. So anyway, I just wanted to push back a little bit on this idea of like, put aside climate difference. There's clearly reasons why you wouldn't want to build the same home in Ohio that you'd build in Texas or whatever, right? But putting aside those differences, like, are we just giving consumers too much choice because we're not building a product that they just like off the bat? And is there a world in which we could really think of a house like a car and just be, have a few major firms that are just cranking out a lot of them and scaling to profitability?
Well, yeah. So a few things. Like, I think it's important to think of the factory landscape as being there are big scaled players that do have kind of a production line approach with pretty healthy margins. Like, look at the two larger publicly traded companies in Champion and Cavco. They run like mid 20s gross margins and like 12 to 13% EBITDA margins with a really high free cash flow conversion. Like, those are pretty profitable scale businesses that are factory building housing. Now, if you look at the kind of smaller end of the spectrum where you have smaller factories that are independent, frankly, if they were at the 70, 80%, 90% utilization you're citing, most of them aren't there, by the way. They would love to be there.
Mm,
And so I think it can work, and the factories do a good job of building increasingly attractive products to the end consumer. And there are parallels to like auto manufacturing that can be brought into it. But at the end of the day, if you're building a car, you can build the exact same thing and kind of change, the paint color and some interior trim level things, but you're still kind of building the same thing. With a
hmm
home, the amount of just specificity that goes into specific configurations for a specific application becomes very different. And so for a factory to do this really well, what they need to do is have the ability to make, the same physical bones of a product, perhaps the same, but then be able to pretty quickly adapt their raw material inputs to configure the type of flooring and the counters and the cabinet type and the colors and blah, like all that stuff. And so there's just more degrees of complexity that go into manufacturing a home offsite, which some of the factories are really, really, really good at doing. And they're
mm,
building, in some cases, really appealing product. So it can be done. And the parallels to the auto industry are there, but it's not exactly a like for like kind of comparison.
hmm
But the overall principle of, yeah, when you build things with mass manufacturing and economies of scale in a factory setting, it's more efficient, 100%. The same thing is true with housing, but you still need to build a product that people want at the end of the day. And that's more than just changing the color on the outside and having like, a radio upgrade or different wheels on it. There's just a lot more complexity into the home building side of this. And
Yep.
that's where, I think companies like Villa that are aggregating demand with standardized, consistent product, we don't take the view that every home is kind of a one-off thing. We have certain SKUs that we can build that we've pre-designed and engineered and costed out with our factory partners that we can build repeatedly at scale with a high degree of alignment with the factory, which is pretty unique in the industry. And there's a lot of choice architecture that goes into that. Like, you can pick from a limited range of certain options within configuring the product, but you can't have everything you want.
Mm,
so
hmm hmm
so it's about choice architecture at the end of the day, and where you draw the line on how many choices can be brought into this really drives the level of factory efficiency, which then translates into the ultimate marginal cost for the consumer. And I think the industry is still kind of figuring out where to strike that balance, frankly.
Sean, that brings up a lot of questions. I know we don't have time to unpack all of them, but you mentioned what could be and where we kind of see this going. So we were both at Blueprint recently talking to a lot of innovators. We have a lot of founders and soon to be founders who listen to this show. So I guess I just want to ask you, if you weren't leading Villa Homes, if you weren't doing what you're doing, what would you be doing, or what would you recommend a founder look at that's a gap right now, or a space where you're like, man, I wish a company was doing that, or I wish somebody was working on that alongside us? Is there something that comes to mind that you've seen recently, or that you've thought of recently, is just like, somebody should go solve that problem while we solve this problem?
The landscape of financing opportunities out there is pretty broad. Now, that's hard to do as like a quote unquote tech startup. It may be more fintech, but I think there's a dearth of sophisticated, flexible lenders who can understand both infill home building and offsite home building. And if you believe in what we've been talking about for the last hour as being the direction that the home building market will kind of increasingly go, the lending opportunity in this space, I think, is really compelling for folks that can figure that out and do it well with an approach that can be very collaborative and flexible and thoughtful about how to work with infill developers and offsite home builders. And there are lenders doing that. It's not like a complete white space with no competition. There's some really good lenders out there doing it now that we work with that are great. But I think the opportunity set there is pretty compelling for someone to come in with a really data-driven, tech-enabled, client-centric approach for providing fundamentally construction financing for where home building is likely to go.
Awesome. You're preaching to the choir. That's the thing I would be doing if I weren't doing this now too. That's amazing. Hey, Sean, thank you so much for what you do. Thanks for joining us and talking with us. I mean, I think your contributions to the industrialized construction industry and how we're thinking about it have been so valuable. And I think where you're starting with ADUs is an area that I think there's so much opportunity. It's been really cool to watch what you guys are doing. So anyway, so thanks again for taking the time to talk with us.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you, Sean.
Cheers. Well, that's going to do it for this episode. We'd love to hear from you. Send us an email at podcast@thehousinginsiders.com. If you like what you hear, we always love it when you give us feedback or leave us a review.
And please hit subscribe. That way all of our episodes find your feed. As always, thank you, Keenan Chen, for our music.